Hey everybody, how's it going? I just wanted to make a shorter, more topical video here, and I plan on doing a bit more of these as the months go by. In addition to streams and so on, there should be a lot more content coming out of this channel. So if you want to uh, get a sense of what I'm up to, you should follow me on Twitter. Follow me, subscribe to the channel, all that fun stuff. But I did want to make a video here, maybe have to do with a moral issue, a moral issue that I think needs to be addressed, especially among young Zoomer Catholics, young Zoomer converts. I think this is an issue that tends to crop up, in my opinion, and it's not talked about all that much. And oftentimes, um, when we as Catholics talk about morality and the dangers of sin and the malice of sin, I think the focus is usually placed on what happens when we actually commit these sins in general in our external actions. And this is for good reason. After all, it's in committing sins that we tarnish the divine image of Christ in our souls and do violence to the nature that God gave us. But that's not really what I'm talking about in this video. That's not really what I'm addressing. Because there's another more subtle relationship to sin that is actually a sin in itself, but is more internal and tends to get overlooked. And I think and it's very common actually, especially as I was saying, among young Zoomer converts and reverts in particular. And as I plan to demonstrate later, I actually think this kind of relationship to sin that I'm going to talk about, this more subtle, this more interior kind of sin, I think in many cases this is more spiritually dangerous than actually falling into such sins in our external acts. But I know that's a little bit abstract. So what am I really talking about? What I'm really talking about here is not so much, as I was saying, the outward commission of a sin as an exterior act, but more having to do with the glorification of sin. The glorification of sin, particularly in our words, our thoughts, our conversation, and even in our humor. Yes, even in our humor. Shocker. And of course, as I'm sure most of you can guess, this usually has to do with sins against the sixth and ninth commandment, right? The sexual sins, the sins of impurity. Um, Now, this kind of glorification of sin, it happens when, I'm going to give kind of a definition of what I mean here. It happens when we talk about these sins or think about these sins or even joke about these sins in such a way that, at least for a time, we're aligning our actual internal desires and therefore our wills with whatever malice constitutes the sinfulness of that sin in question. It's as though our detestation of sin, our hatred of sin as such, has an off button that we can, push for the sake of some momentary pleasure that we get from considering that sin in this or that light or in this or that conversational or humorous context. Now, make no mistake, let's not get accused of an overly harsh kind of moral rigorism here. This differs rather substantially from, a merely humorous remark that happens to, maybe virtually contain the concept of a given sin. Because in this case, we're aligning our internal desires with the concept of the sin instead of just using the concept of the sin for the sake of some larger punchline or humorous effect or rhetorical effect or something like that. Um, Here's an example, maybe both to illustrate the difference and to illustrate what I'm actually talking about when it comes to this sin of glorifying sin. So let's say, and this often happens among a young group of guys. I understand it happens, but let's say you're talking about among friends, and you know some guy in your friend group starts talking about, the women that they'd want to hypothetically have a sexual encounter with, but in a joking way. And, they talk about it in a rather, graphic way on top of it all. And while this may be a joke, and while it may not manifest an actual intention on their part to carry out the act, and again, exterior actions in the external forum, It does nevertheless bring into alignment their desires, their internal desires, and the sin of fornication. It has to. Like in the act of making the remark, if it reflects that interior desire, in other words, it's like I would if I could, then that desire is being activated. It activates, however briefly, an impure desire, and moreover exposes the person who makes the remark and those who are listening to the near occasion of sin, in taking some kind of pleasure in the idea itself. And the more graphic it is, of course, the more proximate that danger is. So the sin of glorifying sin here, it doesn't just consist in a joke pertaining to a sexual matter, but it consists in the type of remark that is being made. Now, why do I say that this behavioral tendency can be more dangerous in some cases than actually falling into those sins themselves? It seems a bit crazy at first glance. Well, first things first, it does, of course, depend, right? If you're falling into, say, sins of lust, not primarily out of weakness, but out of like an unrepentant kind of a malice, then no, of course, glorifying sexual sins in particular is not more dangerous. But if when you fall into these sins, I'm talking about actually committing those sins and external acts, and it is primarily out of weakness, such that when you fall into them, it's really due to an abundance of passion that comes from the concupiscible appetite, and afterwards you feel contrite and sorry for that lapse in judgment, that lapse in self control. This is a dynamic that can very easily dispose the soul toward receiving the grace of God's mercy. It doesn't totally reflect the interior disposition of the heart towards God. In this sense, we can kind of borrow slightly from the fundamental option theory. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but there's this theory in moral theology put forward by people like McCormick, and they basically said that a mortal sin is more having to do with one's fundamental orientation towards God, not in any specific act. And of course, we're not going to advocate that. That was refuted by John Paul II in Veritatis Splendor. But there is a certain degree of truth to it in the sense that while mortal sin may not consist in this fundamental option, nevertheless, we can kind of classify sins of weakness versus sins of like unrepentant malice. And the unrepentant malice is kind of more out of that fundamental option kind of dynamic. So, so in this case, it's not the soul can more easily dispose itself towards God's mercy. But when we go out of our way to glorify sin, to glorify it, even if we aren't necessarily committing those sins ourselves, this, in my view, it reflects a deeper corruption of the inner heart, because what it does is it reflects a more deeply embedded malice of the soul that doesn't see sin as an albeit difficult enemy, still an enemy to vanquish, but as a friend, that you kind of pal around with, even when you're in a sober, rational state of mind. The fact that you're in a rational and sober state of mind glorifying sin, that's what really gets at the deeper corruption of the heart, because you're not under duress, you're not under an overabundance of passion, you're not suffering under that, you're not moved to that. You're in a rational, sober state of mind, and yet you speak of sin as though you don't really detest it, as though your desires and your will is aligned with it. So it's really it's a spiritual tendency that puts you in the danger of being actually indisposed, in my view, to true and authentic contrition over the sins that you're glorifying. This is sort of adjacent in some way to the sin of against the Holy Spirit, like the blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. Because what is the blasphemy against the Holy Spirit? It's not just impenitence. It's any deliberately it's any deliberate barrier that you put up that prevents authentic and true contrition in the soul. And I think the glorification of sin can take on that tendency. It can take on that disposition. and it can take the form of supposedly lighthearted conversation, as we were saying earlier, like I would do X, Y, or Z sexual sin, or speaking of one's past sins as though they were good, and delighting in those sins as you talk about them. This is the heart of the malice of what I'm talking about. And I want to take an opportunity to address like a common objection that I get, specifically because this usually has to do with like sexual humor and sexual remarks. It's an objection from the standpoint that I'm being too uptight about this, or that I'm approaching this from too much of a rigorous point of view. And they'll often say, okay, well, why are you singling out sexual humor, right? When we wouldn't have this kind of a stringent approach toward, a joke about murder or something like that. And I want to address that head on because it does get to a profound point in moral theology that illustrates the difference. The reason why explicit sexual comments or jokes, especially those which convey a desire under the guise of humor, or those which are directed towards somebody of the opposite sex that's like not your spouse. The reason why those are far more dangerous from the standpoint of Catholic moral theology than jokes about like violence or murder, or conversation about violence or murder, or like playing video games that have violence or more or murder, or watching media. It's easily understood this difference when you consider which passions sexuality on the one hand and violence and murder on the other come from, respectively. So you really have to get into some philosophical anthropology to get what I'm talking about. See, violence and murder, if we're going on the Thomistic scheme, these stem from specifically the passion of anger. And anger is an irascible passion. What that means is that it's aroused when presented with some obstacle or some difficulty. Something's in the way, in other words. It arises precisely because somebody is pushed to the brink of their limits. And for most people, that's a rare occurrence. It's not triggered upon being exposed to violence or murder, or making a joke about it. That passion is not triggered. It has to be triggered in the face of some obstacle, pushing you to the brink, as I said. Now, sexuality, on the other hand, this originates not in the irascible appetite, but in the concupiscible appetite. So, in other words, it's simply one of our natural desires that can be activated to some degree or another by the slightest amount of sexual stimuli, whether external or in the mind or in the imagination. And so, when somebody makes a joke about murder or violence, or they're playing a game or watching a movie that has murder or violence in it, for the vast majority of the people, it's not going to conjure up a near occasion of arousing the underlying passion that animates those things. And as such, therefore, they're not usually near occasions of sin. However, when someone's making the kind of explicit sexual comment or joke or remark, or even in one's thoughts that I mentioned above earlier, they're almost invariably on some level activating the illicit passion itself in the act of making the remark. Um, Again, so long as it's directed toward or about someone other than their spouse, right? What they're doing in this act of making the remark, they're stirring up within themselves the illicit desire itself by expressing it, either directly or indirectly, even under the guise of humor. And for that reason, it scarcely can avoid, in my view, and the void of any like moral theologian worth their salt. Even the laxists would admit this, by the way. I think it can scarcely avoid the grave sin of impurity as such, or at least of scandal. And scandal, by the way, is a sin against charity, which is, grave on that basis. It's important to point out, like, the more graphic it is, of course, the more directly the will is involved in activating that passion. And so, therefore, the more abstract and the more removed the remark is from one's desires, the more safe it's going to be from a moral angle. So you got to think of it along this kind of spectrum. Now, I'm not saying this to be some kind of like a spurg or a rigorist, or something like that. Some obsessed, uh, concern trolling. I'm not engaging in that. In fact, there are a lot of people on Twitter, a lot of e-Thomists that harp on me for being some kind of a laxist or something, which is ridiculous, but they say it. So don't misunderstand where I'm coming from. I'm not coming from like a turbo rigorous point of view, but just because humor and good fun and conversation is often supposed to make light of darker or edgier elements of human life, that doesn't mean that Christ is not Lord over that as well. He's Lord over everything, and that includes this element of human life, as he reminds us in the Gospel of Matthew concerning idle words. And we're going to have to make an account for everything that we say ultimately. So Christ is Lord over that dimension of our lives. And if I was going to close with words of Jesus here, he says, we have to be wise as serpents yet innocent as doves, right? So it's not to say that we can't that all of our conversation has to be, this G-rated kind of environment. No, I'm not saying that at all, but we have to avoid, like I said, aligning our desires insofar as we express them and insofar as we harbor them with the malice of sin. That's what really has to be avoided. There has to be a wall of separation between our desires, the desires that we harbor and the desires that we express and the remarks that we express, and the malice of sin. For that, we have to have absolute hatred and detestation, nothing short of that. So I hope that was helpful. I hope that was a helpful little moral reflection here. It's just an issue that I kind of see online pretty frequently, like I said, among young Zoomer converts and reverts, for understandable reasons. They're just getting into the fray of things. They're just getting into the faith. I get it, but that's all the more reason why I think it should be said. And I will say this as well. If young Zoomers, they convert to the faith, they're brought to the church, and yet they just return back to the same kind of, smut that they were engaging in before being Catholic, on some level, like in one very narrow sense, they're not really all that better off. In fact, in one respect, they're worse off, because all they're doing then at that point is just compiling, adding on additional layers of culpability. Like that's at that point the only difference in their lives is that their unchanging their unchanged sinful lifestyle has just received an added layer of culpability to it, right? So it's like we really have to be careful about falling into these kinds of traps and behavioral tendencies. So that's kind of all I have to say about that. If you're interested in the content that I make, if you like what I do here and you want to see more of it, hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, join me on Patreon if you want to support the stream. You get all kinds of things. You get unlimited access to Q&A with me. You get weekly book recommendations, or monthly book recommendations, a monthly article. I'm also putting out exclusive streams. Right now we're doing St. Thomas Aquinas' commentary on the Psalms, so I'm going through this entire commentary on the Psalms, and if you're a patron, you get access to that. In addition, you receive all of the outlines that I put on for these streams that I write. So it's actually up to like a lot of pages of catechetical notes worth that I write to put into these streams, and and just other exclusive perks as well. So there's a $2.99 level for supporter, and you get access to those streams that I was talking about. A $5 level for the Q&A and the monthly book recommendations and the Q&A and the streams. And then the $10, you get all of that, plus you can, per month you're subscribed, you get a video recommendation. So any topic that you want me to cover, I can pledge to do that, or a stream. It can take the form of a stream as well. So I hope that is of any interest to you. God bless you, and I hope you're well.